Hey, it's Joel Mark Witt and Antonia Dodge from Personality Hacker with our good friend, Dr. Beatrice Chestnut, Enneagram expert, Dr. Beatrice Chestnut. Welcome, Beatrice, to the session tonight.
So good to be here with you guys. I really miss you, and I appreciate you that we're having this conversation.
Yeah, this is cool. So let me just kind of give a framework for people listening in right now. This is going to be a little freeform. It's almost like a glorified online panel discussion, a little bit of a laboratory conversation. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about the crossovers between the Enneagram system and the Myers-Briggs system. And then we'd like to open up for some questions. So we're going to let the evening guide us. We're going to have a free-form conversation on some topics. We'll see where things go. We'll see what questions we get, and we'll be responsive to that as a team here to, hopefully answer everybody's questions. One comment I want to make about this, though, is we don't have a lot of space tonight to do direct profiling. So if you're not clear, if you've got confusion around your Myers-Briggs personality type or your Enneagram personality type, in the course of conversations, we might talk to you about your type or help, dive in there and maybe work on something. But really, this isn't going to be a very good format to bring questions about which type am I? It would take up a lot of time, and we wouldn't be able to get to everybody else's questions and to get to the discussion we want to do tonight. So the best thing you could do when you come with a question tonight is to say, hey, if you know this, you could either say, here's my Myers-Briggs type, here's my Enneagram type, or here's my Myers-Briggs type, but I don't know my Enneagram type, but here's my question. Give us as much information about yourself as possible. And we really want to have the questions be personal growth focused as much as we can. We think that'll be the best way to find some of the crossover points, the laboratory elements of this, the experimental nature of it. If we do it in a personal growth framework, we can then attend to that from the frameworks of Beatrice with Enneagram and myself and Antonia with Myers-Briggs. Did either one of you guys want to say anything, Beatrice or Antonia, about what I just mentioned?
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
I most always have something to say. One of the reasons why we're kind of keeping this free form is that we would love to team up with B and do some really cool crossover stuff. We've been talking about it since we became pals. But we're in the embryonic levels of this because we have a definitive expertise on one side and Beatrice has a definitive expertise on the other side. And we're each learning more and more about each other's systems. We learn more and more about Enneagram all the time. Beatrice learns more and more about Myers-Briggs all the time. But the one thing that we do have in common is that we are passionate about applying these systems to development and growth. And we know that our portion is not always the full picture. So one of the reasons why we would love questions to be framed in like personal development style or challenges you might be facing in your life, problems that you might be having with people in your life or work situations, is the context that I'm creating right for who I am? Is it ergonomic for my personality types? There's going to be a dimension of insight that each of the systems will bring. And so what we'd like to do is we'd like to start seeing what emerges as we answer these questions, as we have conversations with each other. And we'll have a little bit of conversation just with each other, just on air.
In general, yeah.
In general, we'll just be talking like panelists do. And also when we get questions, we'll be able to start seeing what emerges as one of the best ways to address a merger of these two systems as it relates specifically to growth and development. So that's why there's a little bit of a, how is this working? Yeah. How are you guys going to be addressing this? What does it look like? And we're like, well, I guess we'll know at the end of the call how it all pans out because we would like it to emerge. We would like it to be a systemic emergence. And then once we do that and do a little bit of test iterate, then we'll know how to like dial in a really good merger between the two systems as we relate to those systems. So that's a little bit reason why there's some openness here. Mm-hmm. That was the only thing I wanted to mention.
Yeah, cool.
Right. And I think my way of saying kind of the same thing is that we're a little bit in learning mode here. Like what kinds of things do we need to be thinking about and questions do we need to be addressing to really understand how the Enneagram and the MBTI can be usefully thought about together, or how they can be complementary, or how there are overlaps that can be usefully explored. So I think part of what we're wanting to do is provide some value for people in answering questions about the MBTI and the Enneagram, maybe at the same time. But also, I know for me, I'm very much still in learning mode about the MBTI because I'm very interested and curious to expand my knowledge of it. And so I'm interested to hear, like, what are the important questions that we can, on the one hand, address a little bit now, but also continue thinking about so that we can continue the collaboration that we've started to provide even more thorough and deep answers going forward. So I think the Enneagram model, the Enneagram system as applied as a personal growth tool, for me is valuable because the Enneagram is all about personal growth. I think sometimes when people get interested in finding out what type they are, they can get enamored of just, okay, how can I learn a little bit about myself, and stop with the insights around, oh, I'm a 3 or I'm a 5 or I'm an 8, and not really delve deeper. But the Enneagram symbol, and especially the tradition it comes out of, the ancient tradition of philosophy and ancient wisdom, which I think it comes out of, which is a lot about answering the big questions of, like, why are we here? And what's the purpose of a human life? And how can we develop ourselves and live a more fulfilling life? I think those are at the heart of what the Enneagram is all about. So I see the Enneagram as a starting point. When you learn your type, it's the beginning point of what's my journey to become more fulfilled, to become happier, to be more effective, to have better relationships. And I think the Enneagram has the potential to shed a lot of light on, here are your strengths. Here's what you're really good at. And it's important to know that so that you can own it more fully and leverage your strengths more consciously. But also, what are your blind spots? You know, what are your challenges? And how does knowing the full picture of what your Enneagram style is all about help you understand how to integrate those blind spots and see more of what you tend not to see just because your focus of attention is on a particular thing and not on something else? And how can you also use the Enneagram diagram to almost integrate the strengths of other types of 360 degrees of reality, because the Enneagram is formed on a circle. How can you take on and adopt and integrate the strengths of the other types so that you can be a more full human being? You can create more wholeness in your life. So the Enneagram is all about growth. And I think once you know your type, you have a lot of different directions in which to go in terms of finding ways to become more self-aware, to meet challenges, and to meet your higher potential in many different ways.
Awesome. Thanks for that. All right.
Okay.
All right.
So thank you, Beatrice, by the way, for that. We had to do a quick break for the audio here. Antonia, while I'm queuing up some of these, why don't you speak to some of the personal growth opportunities with Myers-Briggs briefly, because there's a ton of questions coming in. I want to start queuing some of these up.
So what's interesting about Myers-Briggs is, unlike Enneagram, which started out as a personal development tool and has always been packaged in that way, has always been presented in that way, and really what I love about Enneagram, as I learned about it more and more, is that it's effectively an ego transcendence tool and has never pretended to be anything else. That's probably one of the reasons why its popularity has been slower than Myers-Briggs to get into the public consciousness, because it hits directly on the ego piece, which is not something that everybody always recognizes that they need. Whereas Myers-Briggs started out as a career tool, like from its inception. It started out to help women be placed in World War II to jobs that would meet their potential, because the workplace was now, all the men had gone to war, the workplace was, or like all these women were now needing to enter the workforce in order to make up for the absences, but they didn't really have any background in knowing what they should be doing. So the Myers-Briggs instrument was originally designed as a career tool.
It was like an aptitude. Yeah,
like an aptitude tool. So, but it's built on the back of Jung's work on basically what became what we know of type dynamics and cognitive functions. So the embryonic inception point is not career, but its official starting point was, and so that's how it has been packaged and promoted and has been in the business world for decades and decades and decades. And when we started talking about Myers-Briggs in terms of personal development, which we're not, of course, the only people talking about that, but you could see that when personality hackers started really going, like, I think this is what we're going to talk about. We're just going to talk about type, Myers-Briggs type as it relates to personal development. There was such a hunger for it because people who are super into Myers-Briggs recognize a major opportunity to become a better version of themselves by recognizing how their function stack works. And so when we talk about Myers-Briggs, we don't just talk about the 4-letter dichotomy. We talk about the cognitive functions that make up the bulwark of the system. And as far as the dichotomies go, there's some personal development opportunities there. There's a lot of recognition of our own wiring and permission we can give ourselves. Like when somebody finds out they're an introvert, that's usually something that moves the needle for them hugely, right? They go, oh, I'm an introvert. That's a big deal. Like it's good to know that about myself. Same thing with intuitives. Just kind of understanding those dichotomies is helpful. But when you get to the cognitive function piece, and in particular, the stacks that are represented, cognitive function stacks, or what we call the CAR model in each of the types, that's when you can really see some magic happen. And those functions diagnose the things we're going to be interested in looking at, like the part of the blind man and the elephant, the part of the elephant that we are just naturally attracted to looking at, which is what our perceiving process is, how we take in information, what catches our eye, what's interesting to us. And then the decision-making or judging process is all the should statements that live in our head. The world should be this way. Why aren't things working the way that I think they should be? And then recognizing that they come in a descending order of strength, and that we have them in a descending order of magnitude and impact, and not just in strength, because it's not like the stronger ones impact us more. The weaker ones can impact us just as much as the strong ones do. They just impact us in a completely different way. So recognizing our mental wiring in terms of strength and magnitude and influence and how it all works together, that's really, I think, where the personal development opportunities live, because we can start to observe the limits, like the limitations of how we're naturally wired based on the influences we've had in our outside world. Like if we are wired to see the world a certain way, but we've been surrounded by people who are wired to see it in a different way, all of a sudden it makes sense why we've had to fight our whole life to represent our own perspective. It lets us know when we're being self-centered, when we are demanding things be our way as opposed to a more balanced way. When we really understand how each of these functions work and where they fit into our personal stack or our CAR model, we start to recognize which ones we need to be spending more time working on and developing and growing. We recognize some of the built-in limitations of each of these functions and ways to exercise them and to become better. And I think what ends up happening with Myers-Briggs and personal development and type development is that eventually we get to a point where we start to recognize that we don't need this diagnostic tool as much anymore. We validate ourselves. We recognize that this is just kind of these are the programs we have, these are the operating systems we've been wired to have, and we get to a certain point where we stop resisting how we're naturally wired, we accept it, we work on it, and we make it better, and then we move the needle, and then eventually we just kind of go, well, that's just one way of looking at it, right? And then we stop being so much in our own shit, basically. We stop being like so in our own, like, well, there's something wrong with me, or why can't I be better? Or we graduate from that to, oh, I can be better. Here's the specific ways. Here are the specific ways I can be better. And then we get to a place where like, I am better and I'm self-accepting and this isn't the only way I have to, I don't have to be so much of my own stuff all the time. I can actually see a bigger picture and I can show up to the world as opposed to trying to get the world to tell me who I am or how I operate or validate me. I stop needing that so much because I've already done that for myself. And now I can show up giving to the world. And I think I think that living inside the Myers-Briggs system is something that has probably only within the last decade really exploded on the scene. Because I've been reading Myers-Briggs books forever. I've been reading them forever and ever and ever. And I've been reading them in all sorts of contexts and relationships and love and business and just type descriptions.
But this concept of specifically using functions to do developmental work on ourselves, to become better based on our awareness of where these functions fit. I think that that's something that has always been there and people have always talked about it, but it's right now becoming a thing. And because it's becoming a thing, and that has definitely struck people so much, we get emails all the time about how it's been a game changer for them. And that's just us kind of talking about it, just like sort of discussing it, not even like saying specific things necessarily, but just being like, hey, this is kind of how it works. And people are being, oh my gosh, and then like, it just changes everything for them. I think the power is in the results. Like you can really see how powerful this tool can be for development and growth, even though it wasn't necessarily designed that way from the beginning. But that's what lives in there. That's the gold that can be mined from it. And so I think applying both of these systems, you talk about Enneagram, and I think Myers-Briggs isn't specifically an ego transcendence tool, but it can become an ego transcendence tool because it helps introduce us to ourselves in a way that makes it so that we're not resistant anymore. We don't resist who we are. We're not resistant to the world's feedback. We're not resistant to the inner world of dragons. We stop resisting so hard and we just kind of accept. And then when we do that, now we have the ability to take our ego as opposed to just being in it all the time and kind of get a sort of a meta perspective on it and go, I can form a relationship with this ego. I can form a relationship. Like I can be friends with myself. I can be friends with this ego. And I don't have to constantly be trying to like look for reasons why I'm not broken. I can just go, oh, this is how it works. That's cool. So I think what I love about both systems is that I love that Enneagram started that way, and I love that Myers-Briggs is emerging to become that. And I think that's why I have a fondness for both systems so much.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So we're cool to jump into some questions. We got them flowing in here.
I'm ready.
As we answer, more are going to come. So here we go. Let's get ready. So this is from Rachel. Hi, my name is Rachel. So this is gonna be something this is a weaving question right out of the gate. I'm an INFP, type 2. It seems like INFPs are usually type 4s in the Enneagram system. Sometimes it feels weird being an FI dominant, so authenticity or introverted feeling dominant in the Myers-Briggs system, in an FE body, so to speak. I guess she's referring to FE body being the Enneagram type. Do any of you have any thoughts on the INFP type 2s and how we can best navigate the world? So we can weave this together, kind of co-create an answer for Rachel. Thank you, Rachel, for the question, by the way.
Yeah, so Beatrice, I'm going to, if it's okay, I'll just jump in a little bit. Because I know
please do.
So INFPs are usually considered more artistic types. And even we have a tendency to talk about how introverted feeling or authenticity as your dominant as an INFP is very expressive and self-expressive, and it wants to express in a more artistic way, and it oftentimes feels very misunderstood. And so because of that, there's an association with type 4s, because type 4s kind of have a natural leaning to that way, whereas type 2 is more of a check-in, and I'll let Beatrice talk about type 2s a little bit more, but it's usually associated with people who have extroverted feeling or harmony as a process in their Myers-Briggs stack, or FJs. And I think because there is some crossover in how INFPs and type 4s show up in descriptions, they can oftentimes be conflated with each other, even though they're not the same. It just means that you're going to have a different flavor that comes up as an INFP. It's going to be a little different. You'll probably be more... an INFP, too, is going to be more in touch with outer world feedback as opposed to a type 4 INFP, which would be a little... they would probably kind of double down on that nobody can understand me piece. That's what happens. When Myers-Briggs types fall into their most resonant Enneagram type, what ends up happening is they oftentimes sort of double up on the same behaviors. Like an INFP is already kind of feeling invalidated in order to feeling it's impossible to express themselves. And then when they're also a type 4, then it just kind of turns it into, like, it sort of locks it in. It amplifies it, exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and was there a specific question about, or just any thoughts? My thought on this is that I kind of like it when different, like Myers-Briggs types have a very seemingly disparate Enneagram type. Because it's one of the reasons why not every single person that's a Myers-Briggs type is going to show up the same, first of all, because they can be any Enneagram type. But also, it ends up showing a side to them that they might not have developed otherwise, because all of their wiring encouraged them to go down this path, as opposed to their wiring encouraging them to go down two different paths. We recently met, or we know actually on our team, is an INTP who's probably a 2, which is crazy wackadoodle. To have an INTP be a 2. He's one of the most touchy-feely, sweet, huggy INTPs, and INTPs, Beatrice, are oftentimes considered sort of these cold robots. I've never seen them that way, but that's sort of their stereotype, is that, they're all Data on Star Trek, right?
Right.
But the moments when his introverted thinking or driver show up are very clear. Like he was talking about the podcast. He's like, yeah, when Joel talks, I'm just like, shut up, Joel, stop talking. I want Antonio to talk. And I was like, whoa, you can't say that. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm just, that wasn't what I meant. But it's like these moments of the introverted thinking just coming out and being so obvious. I'm like, you're definitely an INTP, but at the end of the day, he wants to give everybody a hug on his way out. So what I love is that when the Enneagram types and the Myers-Briggs types seem to be very opposite of each other, you get somebody who's probably had more challenge through life reconciling it, probably had more difficulty coming to terms with two different parts of their wiring at odds with each other, and that actually in amongst that sort of chafing together, and in amongst that sort of having to figure it out and reconcile it, and it's not so easy. I actually think that I think that a more balanced person comes from it. Not that you can't be balanced if you are the types that are more traditional, but I think it's in sort of an enforced balance comes up, and I think with I'd love to hear your perspective on type 2s, but when somebody, Beatrice, is more of that self-reflective artist, but is a type 2, have you seen that combination yourself? Not just a person who's naturally a service person who's constantly like the grandma baking cookies, but more of an artistic expression of a type 2. Have you seen that combination yourself?
Yes, yeah, and I love this conversation, because I think one of the things we need more than anything when we're talking about, first of all, understanding the Myers-Briggs types and the Enneagram types, is to understand the possibilities that exist even within a specific category. And so to not get, I think there's always a danger to stereotype, like 2s are only the, like the Jewish mothers baking cookies, or the caretaker codependence, and I think there's, again, a lot of times based on history and biography, there's a little bit more fluidity. There's a little bit more possibility that are in these categories than I think people often start to think when they're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I understand what a 2 is? Or how do I understand what an INFP is, And so I think what I would say to this question, and I'm tempted to have Joel repeat it again, just for both the benefit of me and the audience, to kind of focus again on what are we speaking to here.
Yeah, so my name is Rachel. I'm an INFP type 2 social. It seems like INFPs are usually type 4s. Sometimes it feels weird being an FI dominant, so an authenticity or introverted feeling dominant, in an FE body, so to speak. Do any of you have any thoughts about INFP type 2s and how they can best navigate the world?
Oh, and I was going to say, interestingly enough, Beatrice, you self-identify as an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, and you're a type 2.
I was just going to say that.
Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. So very close, right? I'm an ENFP, and so I think 2s can go either way when it comes to being more extroverted and more introverted. And one of the things I wanted to state that I have been really appreciating as I've been learning more and skilling up in the Myers-Briggs is that I think out there is a really limited and not not very right, not very correct view of what it means to be introverted and extroverted. You know, I hear people say all the time, oh, I get energized by being alone versus I get energized by being with people. And I think I think it's more complex than that in the way that I've heard you describe it and the way I've been reading about it. And it's really more like you're saying about cognitive functioning. What are you indexing when you are thinking, in a way? Are you more indexing what's kind of an internal set of standards, or are you more indexing what's going on the outside? And I think twos, I would say, especially in terms of answering this question, I think twos, there are some twos who are very four-ish, right? I don't think it's only fours that can be, say, introspective or artistic or referencing a certain kind of desire for self-expression or creativity. I think there are some twos, and again, here we might mention subtype in the Enneagram lexicon, if you will. I think we need to always remember, you know, the subtype dimension, which is, of course, the fact that there are 3 versions of each of the 9 types. Sometimes I think, well, the Enneagram has got to be a little bit simpler than the Myers-Briggs because there's 16 Myers-Briggs types and only 9 Enneagram types. But actually, there are 27 Enneagram types if we think about the 3 versions of the 9 types. So there's complexity in both systems.
Well, and I was going to say, she said she's a social 2.
A social 2, right?
Yeah.
So that gives a little bit more. Now, typically, I sometimes think the self-preservation 2 is the one that can look a little bit four-ish. But again, a lot depends on what your history was. Sometimes I find what types your parents were influences how you show up. So I think I advocate for a bit of fluidity and openness in how we understand, say, what a 2 is or what a 4 is or what an INFP is. And I think it's perfect. It makes a lot of sense that you could be an INFP and also be a 2 from the point of view of, you know, what influences have you had that also influence how you pay attention and what's important to you and things like that. But like I said, I'm an ENFP, which, you know, isn't that far away from Rachel. And I'm very much a 2. I'm a self-preservation 2 first, and then a social 2 second. And I think that a lot of these things can sort of overlap with each other in ways that make a lot of sense.
I think one of the questions. I mean, I know we have a lot of questions, so I don't want to spend over amount of time. But one of the things when you said, "How do I navigate the world as an INFP who's going to show up in a little bit more of in a 2 way?" Is boundary setting something that 2s have to do a lot of work around?
Yes. Yeah.
And I would say that probably as an INFP, one of the nice things is that INFPs versus, say, FJs, or FPs versus FJs, is that FPs, they have a little bit more of an instinct around boundary setting than FJs do. FJs that use extroverted feeling have a tendency to, that's sort of the struggle of their life, is to figure out exactly where those boundaries are. And I would say probably as an INFP, if you are a 2, a social 2 even, is that one of the challenges you might face that other INFPs have a little bit more dialed in potentially is your boundaries. So I would say one of the things you might focus on is, as a feelers do have some challenges with boundary setting, but as a 2, I would imagine that would probably be the thing to really dial in, is to really look at, as an INFP, you're going to need a lot of alone time. You're going to need a lot of your own time. You're not going to get the same kind of intrinsic reward for being perpetually in acts of service that maybe an extroverted feeling style would, an FJ would. And so your desire to reach out and to keep your boundaries wide open might be a little bit more of a pain point to you than maybe some other types, that this is a more traditional pairing or matchup. So I would probably go way down the road of boundary setting and get really good at that. And make sure that you're doing healthy boundary setting, like understand the concept of like gates that can open and close versus like walls that just shut down, and an over giving into a point where you just hate everybody and everything, and then you go like have to, you have to go hole up and recover for weeks at a time. So in navigating the world, and you maybe could speak to boundary setting a little bit, but I would imagine that's probably something you're going to want to have to you're going to want to dial in.
Yes, I think boundary setting is a really important issue, and I think it's for all twos. It's always something to be paying attention to, and that could be an important piece here in looking at how the Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram type overlap here. Another thing I think we always need to be aware of is level of awareness or health. And I think if someone is an INFP and is a little bit more oriented toward the self-expression or artistic side of things, wanting to be understood, which is a little bit more of a 4 thing in the Enneagram, I think that's actually a really healthy thing for twos. So sometimes it can mean, like, for some reason in your background or in your makeup, there's a desire to be more understood or to express yourself. And that's a really good thing. And so I think sometimes it's important to recognize even within the 2 pattern, there can be a stronger sense of, like, I really want to express myself. I want to create poetry, or I want to somehow express myself and have that be a way that I'm seen in the world. And I think that if as an INFP you have that, which again can be prototypically more 4-ish, but can also totally exist as in a 2 personality, I think that's actually a healthy thing and something that would be good to be owned and worked with, as a strength in a conscious way.
Cool. Yeah. So we have a metric ton of INFP type 9s that have showed up tonight. And weirdly enough, a few of them have so by the way, thank you, Rachel, for your question. And thank you guys a few ladies for chiming in on some of those answers. I'm trying to manage some of this here on consolidating some of the themes that I'm seeing come through. So I have 3 INFP type 9s that came in boom, boom, boom with kind of not necessarily opposing questions. They might even be some similar. So I'm going to just kind of read through these and see if we can mine out some of the keywords and some of the things we could speak to for INFP type 9s in general, because it sounds like there's a lot of them on the call. This will be helpful based on some of these questions we're getting. So I'm just going to read through this. This is from Pamela. This is a really quick question. I'm an INFP type 9. I would love to be pointed in the direction to find my purpose. So purpose is a keyword there. There's somebody that wrote in anonymously that is, basically this person says, I'm interested in the convergence between Enneagram growth and Copilot function growth, meaning can those be combined to maximize both? Or is there predictable alchemy between the two? I'm an INFP 9 and I've done a lot of work in both showing up and asserting as a 9 and in breaking out of my loop states and utilizing any extroverted intuition or exploration, that's what we call it, to get out into the world. But I feel like there could be more to do on a deeper level in joining those two. So the question there, the thought there, the question would be showing up and asserting myself and growing both my Enneagram type as a 9 and also as an INFP growing my exploration function. And then down here, Whitney has another question, INFP type 9 sexual. Here, hi, I really love the interconnectedness of the types, as Beatrice just mentioned, as a way to navigate through life. How do you see the cognitive functions as interconnected? Beside the fact of having a cognitive stack, the car model functions, just curious what your thoughts are. Even though TI, introverted thinking, is not in my cognitive stack as an INFP, I try to use authenticity or introverted feeling as an access point to understanding how TI, introverted thinking, works. Both being introverted judging functions is an example of possible interconnectedness, or connectedness, excuse me. Thanks for doing this webcast. So just some thoughts, and maybe we want to talk a little bit, highlight on these. We don't want to take maybe more than like 7 minutes or so, but let's try to address some of these thoughts from INFP 9s, and then maybe kind of summarize some things for the INFP 9 that might be listening right now, because it sounds like that's somebody that's attracted to this conversation a lot.
Excellent.
So who wants to start?
So yeah, why don't you start, Antonia?
Okay. So they are 3 very different questions. I can the third one seems to be more of a Myers-Briggs type question, so I can do that one on my own. But the concept of assertiveness as a type 9 combined with the co-pilot development of extroverted intuition. What I would love to do, if you would be okay with handling that one right now, and then we'll flip over to the INFP purpose question. So the first one is, can you kind of talk a little bit about, because I'm going to learn from you here, a little bit about what the assertiveness work and that a type 9 needs to do, so I can just kind of get it in my head as I sort of formulate this concept of how it pairs with extroverted intuition development for an INFP.
Absolutely, absolutely. So with nines, you know, when they're in the personality and they're more in the fixated mode, when they're just kind of doing their personality, it's hard for nines to be very assertive. It's hard for nines to kind of find their purpose and live it out in a assertive way, partly because their whole coping strategy in the world is to sort of give way to others, is to avoid conflict and pursue a course that's going to lead to harmony and getting along with others. So the whole thing that nines do habitually is to go to sleep to their own agenda, to their own desires. And so it's hard to be assertive when you're not conscious of what you want, you know, and it's just easier. It's the path of least resistance to say, well, what do you want? I'll just go along with what you want. And then we can be in a good place with each other. We won't fight. There won't be any tension and we can stay comfortable. Now, of course, when nines are on a growth path, that doesn't work because that keeps them from being conscious of and acting on behalf of their own sense of purpose, on their own desires, wants, agenda that they would be assertive in support of. So I think the big growth work for nines is around getting more and more clear on what do I want? How do I feel? You know, what do I feel passionate about? How do I want to contribute to the world? What am I angry about? You know, what's my strong opinion here? Some nines will say they feel more comfortable expressing their opinions, say about politics or about an issue or at work than they do about something personal. But I think when you're doing growth work, it's about how do you act on your own behalf? How do you learn to be more assertive in asserting what you want in your point of view, in furthering your own agenda and your own objectives. So that's a big growth goal for nines. And I think part of the way they do it is starting to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. First of all, it's going to be uncomfortable to assert yourself and allow yourself to be vulnerable to the fact that other people may not like you to be assertive. They might be used to the fact that you're really easygoing and you tend to go along with what other people want. You go along to get along. You don't really assert what you want in a strong way. But it's important to remember that anger is connected to power. It's important to remember that you do know what you want at a deeper level, but just through the course of life, you've often learned to forget that or turn the volume down on that because the priority was getting along with others and maintaining harmony. So I think a big goal when nines are engaged in a personal growth effort is getting really clear on what is my sense of purpose, what do I want, and how can I assert that in more and more powerful ways. And so it's about learning to tolerate discomfort. It's about learning to tolerate conflict, and that conflict can be a good thing. Nines typically don't like conflict because at a deeper psychological level, conflict means separation. And this goes all the way back to sort of where the nine dilemma starts from, which is being separated from the mother or being kicked out of the womb in a way. And so it's about getting comfortable with actually separation can be healthy. The best relationships occur when there is a healthy separation, when you can be your own person and the other person is their own person, and you can come to meet from a point of view of your own separate individuality, which necessarily means you asserting who you are, what you want, how you feel, without regard to whether it's in line with or in harmony with what the other person feels. So I would say being assertive is really key for nines, and it's very important for nines to be working on being aware of what they want and learning to tolerate the discomfort of speaking that in the world and asserting that and knowing that if they're uncomfortable, they're on the right track, actually.
So I'm going to marry this with the question of how do you combine, or where would be the crossover between the development of what you just talked about and for an INFP developing extroverted intuition or exploration. And I literally wrote in the book that we just put into our publisher, I literally wrote extroverted intuition has to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Like, that's the convergence, is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
It's the new normal.
Yeah,
that's right. The new normal is discomfort. And so I think for an INFP or an INTP, that would be a 9, and is trying to find a way to optimize their growth and development, is to just keep getting out of your comfort zone, just perpetually out of your comfort zone. One of the questions we also asked is, what kind of trouble can I get into today? That's what extroverted intuition asks.
I like that.
What's the trouble I can get into today? And so as a 9, getting into trouble is probably kind of threatening because it means you're rocking the boat, but that's part of the assertiveness training. So I would say those kinds of questions, what trouble can I get into? How can I get comfortable with being uncomfortable? That's the convergence. But one thing I would like to say to the INFP that is, it's based on what you just said, which is that anger is connected to power. INFP's inferior or 3-year-old process is extroverted thinking or effectiveness. And because it's at the it's like the baby in the car, there is sometimes a knee-jerk response that INFPs have to this concept of power. Like it is very uncomfortable to think in terms of power, and yet because it's that aspiration, that 3-year-old aspiration inside of them, it's whispering in the back of their head this desire for leadership and power, this desire for status, this desire for impact and moving the needle. But there's an instinct to reject it because they're not 100% sure how to integrate it. So an INFP 9, I would say the other side of development and optimizing your type, beyond just what kind of trouble can I get into and how can I be comfortable with being uncomfortable, is the other piece of integrate, don't reject the desire for power, or the desire that power, what it is that power would give you. Why do you have this subterranean anger thing going on? Like, what is it about power that you would love to be able to bring your powerful self to the world? And because it's your 3-year-old in the Myers-Briggs system, you're going to want to reject it and demonize it and push it away. But it sounds like both the 9 and the INFP need to integrate that, integrate the concept of what power means to them and how they would like to be a force of impact and power. And it doesn't have to come with all that like domination and domineering and hurting other people and all these stereotypes that we get about how power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of... Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
I totally want to say something on that note. I think you're so right. And I think this points to why your car model is so great is, when you learn about dominance and submission, it's actually this submission person who has the power. Right?
Right.
So with nines express power passively. Right? So they're the ones who are into passive resistance or passive aggression. And it's a form of power, but it's almost like a disowned underground form of power. But I think in a way, it can be even more powerful, like the mountain that can't be moved. Like, I'm not going to come up against you and have a conflict and tell you, no, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. I'm going to stand there and nod and be friendly and not move an inch, right? And so I think one of the things I love your car model points to is there's this sort of back seat thing that actually needs to be integrated in a more conscious way. And I think 9s benefit from not having it be this underground kind of subterranean backseat. Like, I've got this power, but I'm not really going to show you my face. I'm not going to assert it in this outward way, but it's there. I mean, I think it actually is, again, part of what we're talking about here when we're talking about growth is flexibility, expansion. Having different options in terms of how we express our power. And when 9s are locked into, the only way I can express power is through passive resistance. It really limits them in terms of what they can do in the world. Now, it is a form of power, and it's often that form of power of you're not going to move me, and I'm not even going to engage with you directly. But I think it helps 9s to recognize they are expressing power. They just may be doing it in a way that it's less conscious It's more in the back seat, it's more the 3-year-old. And that actually it benefits them to be conscious of, okay, how do I really want to express my power? And do I want to allow myself to be more, do I want to allow myself to put it in the front seat and be more openly assertive and take the risk of being more actively assertive instead of having it be something that's a little bit more underground, that helps me not be run over by other people that maybe don't see me or hear me, but that doesn't really put it out there. Hey, this is what I believe. This is what I want. And I'm not going to allow you to push me around in a more active voice.
And what's nice about having extroverted thinking or effectiveness as a 3-year-old representing that thing that gets rejected is that effectiveness is not just power or status or management or whatever. It's impact. It's making something happen. It's a pass-fail criteria that says, I did something. I made it happen. I closed the loop. I made it. And so being able to sort of put language to the part of you that that you might unconsciously be rejecting by going, that's bad. It's bad to be in a position of power because that's corruption, but you're still doing it in this like sort of half-assed way. When really you can put language to it and go, actually what I want is the power of impact. I want to actually make something happen. I want to see return on my investment. I want to put time and effort into something and actually see it flourish. So sort of amalgamating this power as opposed to corruption, more power of moving the needle, more power of like making an impact in the outside world. And so integrating that 3-year-old process as an INFP is going to have return in both the systems. So you'll be able to double up on your development there. And so did you have more you want to say on that before?
Yeah. I was just going to say that's beautifully put. And I would say it's also too about owning it. It's about owning it. Like I own my power. And I think that's a beautiful thing when 9s can really make it more conscious and put it more in the foreground than having it be something where they are powerful, but they aren't really even fully aware of how they're exerting their power, So making it more of something that is an active choice rather than something that they may be acting out in a sideways way that they might not be fully aware of, but it is also, having an impact, but in a not so direct way.
Right, exactly. So then the INFP 9 that said, how can I find my life purpose?
And by the way, it wasn't just her. There have been multiple types, Enneagram and Myers-Briggs, asking that same question about finding purpose. There's been a lot of purpose questions coming up. So rather than me have to attend each one of those individually, maybe we want to just kind of wrap in some general comments as well.
I like it.
That sounds good. So purpose I don't think can be found within your type. Purpose is going to be the emergent of an entire system running, which includes your type. It includes how you're wired, but it's going to have a lot of other components too, I believe, personally. And so when a person is looking for their purpose, knowing your type is helpful, but it won't be the thing that defines your life purpose, whatever that is. I would say, and that's my philosophy. As an INFP, though, all that stuff we talked about of how can I get in trouble today, how do I get comfortable with being uncomfortable, INFPs figure out how they feel about something when they're in the moment. In fact, it's not uncommon for people who use introverted feeling or authenticity to only know how they feel about something after they've already made the decision. So they make a decision, they go, no, that's not what I wanted at all. And they're like, can we reverse course? Can we do something else? Which is why that exploration process of getting you out and trying a lot of new things and exposing yourself to all sorts of radically different experiences is so important, because that's how you calibrate your introverted feeling or authenticity to determine what is important to you. Because you can conceptualize it from home, kinda, but you don't really know until you're there. That's when you know how you feel about it. And so the more exploration you can do, the more getting outside your shell, the more exposing yourself to the world's challenges and troubles and problems and solutions and what means something to you. You might think something means something to you and you get there and it didn't mean anything or not what you thought it did. But this other thing, you didn't even know that existed. And that's totally important to you. So as an INFP, it's still making sure that you are getting into exploration to put yourself in enough situations where your authenticity can go, okay, all right, that's the thing. That's the thing that's important to me. And I didn't know it until I got there. And then, of course, integrating the desire for impact and, like we just talked about, and not pushing that away. Recognizing that purpose is generally tied to impact. And so if you want to have a purpose, that means you're going to have to get used to this idea of having impact, specific impact that will make you need to be a force that goes out into the world as opposed to waiting for things to come to you. Not that the person who asked this is necessarily doing that, but that's a challenge that INFPs can sometimes have, is waiting for it to show up as opposed to going out and making it happen. So, so as far as what your specific purpose is, that will be outside of your type, but you can do things to facilitate finding it as an INFP, which is getting into exploration.
Right. So 2 things I would say about that that come up with what you're saying. First of all, I would say, in terms of finding like your sense of purpose, from an Enneagram point of view, I do think there are certain types that have a harder time connecting to finding their sense of purpose. Top of the list would be 9s and 2s, partly because their attention is so focused out on other people and how is everyone in the environment doing, not as focused in on my own internal agenda and my own internal feelings. So sometimes it can be hard, like, what is my purpose? I know for me, I'm a 2. And it took me a long time to figure out what I wanted to do in life. I had immense anxiety at the end of college because I had no idea, because my attention is not focused in on me and what I want and my feelings and my sense of purpose. So I would say that, first of all, is if you're a 9 or a 2 or maybe a 6, it can be hard to know. It can be hard to access your sense of purpose. Whereas other types can, I think, have an easier time, partly because if you're a 3, you're more focused on goals. If you're a 5, you're more focused on like what's important to you intellectually and so on. The other thing I want to say is about 9s, and it relates to something you just said in terms of like exploration and things like that. I have a good friend who's a 9, and he said something to me recently, and I thought, oh, that's so classic for 9s. And what he said is, and he's a self-preservation 9, so I think it may go even more so for maybe that subtype, but he said, I often don't know how I feel about something or what I want until I actually experience it, right? And it fits in very much of what you just said, I think referring especially to INFPs. But there's a sense of like, I need to explore, like you're saying, I need to try something out and then almost feel like, how does this feel for me? It's like, it's almost like some 9s, especially self-preservation 9s, it's like they can't really operate in the theoretical as much. 6s, 5s, they live more in the theoretical, maybe 7s. It's like, I can imagine what that would be like and think about how I feel about it. But 9s, it's almost like, well, I don't really know what I want or I feel about it until I'm actually doing it. And so I think that's something important for that type can shed light on. If you're a certain type, you may just need to take an action or try something out and give yourself room to understand, how does this feel for me once I'm doing it? And then give yourself the flexibility of, okay, maybe this doesn't feel like the right thing. Or maybe this doesn't feel like it's feeding into my sense of purpose. Maybe I'll try something else. And sometimes I think life is a little bit more like trial and error than we'd like to think it is. And I think that's something that can speak to this question of give yourself the experience. And if you can find a way to have a little bit of the experience instead of like committing to some big thing, then that's great. And try it out and see, how does it feel? Because some types, especially 9s and body-based types in the Enneagram, it's almost like they need to have a sensate experience of, how does this feel to be experiencing it in my body? And then they can sort of get clear of like, oh, this doesn't feel good to me. Or, wow, this does feel right to me. Whereas beforehand, it's hard to just imagine it the way head types can, or maybe some heart types. It's hard to know, ahead of time.
Yeah, excellent. That question about FI accessing TI, I think what I'm going to do is, so that we can give a little bit of airtime to other types.
Yeah.
I think what I'll do is I'll do a Facebook Live about that after this.
It's a great Facebook Live.
Yeah, so I'll do a Facebook Live about it. If you're the person who asked the question and you don't have Facebook and you're like, that doesn't do me any good.
Cross-post it to YouTube.
Shoot us an email at
just
info.
cross-post it to YouTube.
And then we'll cross-post it to YouTube.
We'll do that regardless.
Then I guess we'll cross-post it to YouTube.
Yeah, that way it gets to 2 different formats for people that aren't on Facebook.
Cool. All right, so we'll do a video about that.
So lots of questions are coming in. and we're obviously not going to get to everybody's questions tonight. I'm realizing that it's just going to be impossible because we have, like, people are still getting kicked off the system because there's so many people trying to show up tonight.
Well, we'll do this more. It just means we need to do it more often.
Yeah. So let's zoom out for a second here and get away from a specific type. Just in general, there's two. I'm trying to combine kind of the essence of questions to get a sense of what's going on. So this comes from Jennifer, and then I'll read a second question that comes from, I don't have the name in front of me here in a second, but basically Jennifer says, can you speak to when Enneagram and MBTI, so when Enneagram and Myers-Briggs types match up pretty obviously? It's kind of the first part of this amalgamated question here. And then the next part is, I'm an INFJ, Enneagram 9. Man, the 9s are thick as thieves tonight. This is really general, but how would you all suggest going about finding the crossover between your Myers-Briggs and Enneagram types? I'm aware of both of them individually, but I'd love to further explore how they might overlap and influence each other, and then use them more intentionally together in my personal growth journey. So basically, it's this idea of, are there patterns? So the general question is, are there patterns of types that tend to cross over in the Myers-Briggs system versus Enneagram? And more specifically, what can you look at as a certain type? How do you look for those patterns, and how can you use that information if there are crossovers? So one's more of a general question, and then one's more of an application question based on how to use some of the crossover.
So as far as crossover, there seems to be trends of types that, like Myers-Briggs. I'm going to talk about it first for Myers-Briggs because that's the type, that's the system I come from, and then and you can speak to the Enneagram piece, Beatrice, if you've seen other patterns. But there seems to be certain Myers-Briggs types seem to cluster in certain Enneagram types, but it's not a hard and fast rule. Like INT types have a tendency to cluster around the head-centric types, like 5 and 6. We just talked about, an INFP was like, I'm a 2, that's weird, right? INFPs are usually 4s, but we're seeing a lot of 9s too, and I think they have a tendency to cluster to 4 and 9. And so there's a clustering because there's a compatibility of wiring. And so the strategies are probably going to fit what's already sort of there. But Beatrice, we've already talked about it. You suspect the same thing that we do. We suspect that Myers-Briggs type is actually genetic. I mean, like, it's in your DNA. And you're kind of suspecting the same thing about Enneagram type, that it's hardwired into you. So if that's the case, then that means that there's going to be trends in it because it makes sense to have strategies match wiring. And I've seen so many exceptions to those rules, it's ridiculous. So there are certain types that trend towards certain other Enneagram types, and then you'll see these outliers. Like I mentioned, we have a person on our staff who's an INTP too. That's weird, right? That's unusual.
Potentially a self-preservation too.
A self-preservation too, most likely. And so it's like, that's a fascinating combination. And I've seen enough of those. I say in the past I've seen almost every combination. I haven't seen every combination yet. But that's because I'm not an Enneagram expert. That's because I don't know their Enneagram type. I know their Myers-Briggs type. But my suspicion is that if I could profile like Beatrice does with Enneagram, I probably would have run into just about every combination. And so there are definitely trends. To talk about what all of those trends would be a huge chunk of time and a chunk of change. So I'm going to mentally tag that that's a question, and maybe we can bring it up in a future collaboration and start talking about what that would look like to actually do some legit research around that and to do some legit clustering. But as far as the crossovers, there's definitely trends, but there's enough exceptions to indicate that there's not limitations set there. And the odd combinations are going to come up with people who probably struggle to find their types. Yeah.
I want to throw one more thing in here to the question bin part of this kind of conversation. As I see them, I'm trying to cluster them. Another question that Claudia brought up was, what about the instinctual subtypes? So the instincts of self-preservation, social or sexual, are those across the board also, or do those tend to also cluster around certain Myers-Briggs types? It would be another part of this discussion, I guess. I just thought I'd throw that in there to have.
That I don't know. I don't know if I've done enough, because subtypes are actually a relatively new thing for me. I just learned about subtypes like within the last year.
We learned them from this amazing book.
Like last year I read her book and I was like, this is an amazing book that gives a lot of information I didn't have before. Let's go look her up and see if she'll be on our podcast. So that's like, this is a relatively new thing. So I haven't been scanning for that as well. And I don't know if I can't by sight observe somebody's subtype. So I don't know if there's clusters there. Beatrice, you might have seen something that I haven't seen. But as far as the actual Enneagram types, there are trends, but not rules.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right, right. Joel, can you repeat the question again, just so I speak to it as specifically as I can?
Absolutely. So basically, there's not a really specific question here. There's kind of two parts to a question. So the first part is, are there clusters or are there predictable elements to somebody's Myers-Briggs type indicating they're going to be a certain Myers-Briggs type? And then also, along with the instinctual subtype or the subtypes, or the instincts, because a subtype is how I understand it, make sure I get this accurately, it's your Enneagram type mixed with an instinct creates your subtype. So the instincts themselves are self-preservation, social, and sexual. So are there patterns that we noticed? It probably is, we don't have enough data set to go off this, but you might have something, Beatrice, beyond just, we don't know yet, but that's basically the first part of the question on a zoomed out scale.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm excited about, especially now that you finished your book, is I think it would be really fun for us to kind of really dig down and try to do more, especially because you come from such a growth mindset when you work with the Myers-Briggs. I really want us to kind of flesh this out more. I think obviously there's not a direct one-to-one correspondence, like all ENFPs aren't 2s, all INFPs aren't 9s. But I do think that, like you're saying, I like the word clusters. There are certain cognitive functions that cluster with certain types. One of the things I want to point out, just because I think it's one of the interesting contrasts between the Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram, and this is one of the things I learned at a conference a couple of years ago, but that I've also been reflecting on since I've been reading a book that you guys recommended to me, Lenore Thompson's book, which is that the Myers-Briggs, all of the types, we're all talking about different kinds of cognitive functioning, right? So we're talking basically about different kinds of reasoning. So we're talking about the head level. Whereas with the Enneagram, it starts from the idea that the types are discerned in part by whether they're thinking based, feeling based, meaning they come more from feeling than thinking, or instinctive or movement center based, versus meaning they come more from kind of an instinctual intelligence or a kinesthetic or gut knowing intelligence than a head intelligence. So it's an interesting thing because in a way we're kind of looking at apples and oranges, but at the same time, I think there are ways that we can start to explore how might these things fit together, because like even in the cognitive function of T versus F, even though those are both different forms of reasoning, sort of different things that you consult when you're figuring things out mentally, there is a way that the Fs are going to be probably, tapping into a data set that's more related to feeling or values, as it's the way it's sometimes put. Yeah. So I think that's an interest, I think more needs to be done in this area. But I obviously think that there are certain types that cluster together in certain ways. Now, I think what makes it a little bit more interesting and also more complicated is the instinct level, is the fact that, let's say you take a feeling type, like a 2 or a 4. That's a very much a heart-based thing, so they're going to be, interestingly, thinking with their feelings, right? So it's almost like I'm not really consulting all the data set. My data consists of how do I feel about this primarily, whether I'm aware of it or not. That's the way I'm processing. I'm processing through emotion in a primary kind of way. Now, what complicates that is the fact that self-preservation types, so people who are moved more, not only by their Enneagram focus, let's say it's 2 or 4, sort of an emotional view on the world, and even within the emotional view, a specific focus of attention. Am I liked? How am I doing with people? Versus 4, that might be 2 versus 4. Am I understood by people? How connected are we? Am I going to be abandoned? Things like that. You also have the instinctual impulse that's a part of the picture. And self-preservation, people who have a strong self-preservation instinct who tend to overdo that are going to have an aspect of them that's a little bit more fear-based, that may make them look a little bit more like T, right? That may be a little bit more thinking. Now, I'm a self-preservation too. I'm also very intellectual. I'm very emotional, but I also am very intellectual. And I think part of it is we always have to think about like what type was your parents and what's your biography like. I grew up in a circumstance where the intellect education was how you got perceived in a positive way, right? So as a 2, I want people to like me. I want them to see me in a positive light. So being smart was something that was really important, which is also kind of may tilt me towards T in a way, or something, or it's something being, or a way of being more reliant on a certain kind of cognitive functioning that maybe looks more like thinking. And so that's where it gets a little complicated. But I also think that there's a lot of rich exploration we can do, because I do think that when you mix the straight ahead type in terms of, this is the bias of perception, with the instinct in terms of, okay, I'm going to be a little bit more, if I'm a self-preservation, a little more fear-based, a little bit more thinking-based. If I'm a social type, I'm going to be a little bit more consulting, like what's going on with the group and how can I have influence in the group, which may be tilt me in another direction, versus having a one-to-one focus, which may be a little bit more like, how can I really win over my rivals and make this intense, passionate connection happen with this person? Now, again, sometimes that's indexing to what is this other person like? You know, maybe I'm trying to connect with someone who's not like me, and so I want to be a little bit more like them. So again, part of what I'm doing, obviously, is making it even more complicated. But I do think that if we get really clear on what's the focus of this Enneagram type, how does that focus mix with this instinctual type, we can start to tease apart the elements that help us create a better understanding about, okay, these Myers-Briggs types can tend to be one of these 2 or 3 types. When I've been reading this book, one of the things I'll be reading about a particular, extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, and I'll be like, oh, wow. And I'll write some Enneagram types in the margin. Like, this really sounds like 2, 7, or 4, right? Like everything that's being said about these Myers-Briggs types makes me think 2, 7, or 4, or maybe 9, But over here, looking at these types, ooh, I'm thinking that could be 3, 1, or 5. So I think that there is a kind of way that these things cluster together. I don't think yet I've done enough work, but this is work I'm very excited to do with you guys, since you have so much more expertise in the Myers-Briggs than I do. I think there may be more and more ways we can put more and more words and more clarity to hear the clusters of groups that tend to be more these types, and here's why.
Well, and you touched on something that's even more interesting to me, which is that, you're like I'm an ENFP, I'm a feeler, but based on my Enneagram type, it might look like I'm more of a thinker, even though I'm in like sort of the feeling center. But your thinking process, right, because you have a thinking process just like everybody does, is for you, your 10-year-old in the car model. It's extroverted thinking or effectiveness in the car model, which is also going to, like, that's an important part of who you are in your Myers-Briggs type. Like, your 10-year-old process is a very conscious, you're always attempting to integrate it, and you might become reliant on it based on maybe your Enneagram type. And then in the Myers-Briggs system, we call that a loop, right? When you start to sort of over-rely on that 10-year-old process because of your Enneagram strategy or whatever, encouraging you to go there. And now you're in a Myers-Briggs loop, and you got to get out of that loop now. And so as a 2 and a feeling type, you need to get into your authenticity, your introverted feeling process, which is all about what's my agenda, what do I want, etc., which is what a 2 needs to do, right? So it's like, what I love about all this, and I mirror this as a 3. I'm in the feeling center. I'm a 3 sexual subtype, and I'm an ENTP. But my feeling process is also my 10-year-old process. So my entire life, I had to try to get out of that loop, because I was always going to my feeling process and like consulting with everybody, and is everybody determining my value is good, and checking with everybody else and what my value is, and did I show up right? Did I do the thing I'm supposed to do? Do I get a dog biscuit, right? Like, so like that's been my loop. And so all of my stuff is to get into my thinking process, which is what is radically honest for me, What's an integrity for me as a person, which is what 3 is supposed to be working on. What is your personal radical honesty? How do you drop your mask? So the trends are interesting to me. But what's more fascinating to me is these combinations of seeing how the Enneagram and the Myers-Briggs type manifest together depending upon which functions they're pulling in their stack in order to accommodate for their Enneagram type and vice versa. So I love the concept of the trends too. I'm into it. I want to do that work as well, but I love the intricacy of marrying the two systems. Just knowing your Enneagram and your Myers-Briggs types creates such an interesting overlap of all of these different fleshed out pieces that to me is more interesting actually than the trends personally. So
right.
Yeah. I didn't want to interrupt you if you had something to say, Beatrice.
No, I would just very short add to that. I mean, what I really hear too is, all of this understanding is only as valuable as it helps us grow,
Exactly.
And so I love that that's the way you think. And so, yes, I think that one of the really rich opportunities I think we have to do this work together is almost like bringing together what are some insights that you can get through the Myers-Briggs model about, how you operate and what you need to do to grow. And how can that be really complementary or additive to what you can learn from the Enneagram system about how you can grow? And so I'm really interested and excited about doing that work with you where we can not only figure that out, but make it really clear and accessible for people.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. All right. Okay, so again, I'm trying to batch stuff together. We're getting a lot of comments here about people being very clear and very decisive. Multiples of these come in. I know my Myers-Briggs type. I'm confident about my Myers-Briggs type. I have no question. But when it comes to my Enneagram type, I am struggling. I am struggling so hard. Am I this? Am I that? Can Beatrice help me understand where I should be looking? What should I do if I'm struggling so much? I might even have, some people even have your book. They might have taken online tests. And this is just something they're really struggling with. What would you, how can we help them? What can we give them here to go and find the type that they are?
Right. So first of all, I really understand the struggle. So I want to say empathize with the struggle. I think, in some ways the Myers-Briggs has an advantage because there's been a lot of work ongoing for a long period of time, I think, which you guys are really adding something unique and important to in the work you're doing in terms of clarifying. There's a test that's very effective in helping people guide them to their type. I think in the Enneagram world, it's almost like we haven't really gotten our act together yet, or we haven't gotten clarity or unity around the expression of the types. In fact, I was just having a conversation with someone today, and he was basically, he's trying to figure out whether to have me to do an Enneagram session with his group. And one of the things he was saying is, well, I've looked around at the Enneagram, I've looked different sites and everyone says different things. So I think part of the problem with the Enneagram is that it's relatively new field. Really, it's only been out in the world, and we've only been really working with it since like maybe 1990 or 1988. I mean, it's been coming out since 1970, but really only out in a big way since 1988 or 90. And it's not an academic science in the Enneagram world. I mean, I was trained as an academic, so it's kind of frustrating for me because I want us to be all working together to kind of advance the knowledge in a really clear and coherent way. Here are the types, here are the subtypes, here's to find out how to find your type. But I'm one person, and I have some people that I'm working with who I feel very allied with. But there's a lot of other Enneagram teachers and schools and books out there, and they present it in slightly different ways. So I think that's one thing that just needs to be named, that a lot of the tests out there aren't very effective, and people need to know that. It's very tricky to find your Enneagram type through a test for many reasons. One thing is, sometimes we test in terms of who we'd like to see ourselves as, rather than who we really are. The Enneagram is really good at helping you see your blind spots, but when you're taking a test, sometimes you don't know your blind spots, so that gets reflected in your test results. So on the one hand, the first thing I want to do is empathize with people who are not sure about their Enneagram type. I do a lot of typing interviews, and it's always a little bit of a delicate process, especially because for me, the subtypes are really the key to helping you find your type, because 9 types is a little bit of a blunt instrument, you know, even with 16, and as well defined, as well worked the 16 Myers-Briggs types are, it's actually easier to find yourself in there than it is in these 9 types. So I've been working with the subtypes, this particular approach to the subtypes, which I think helps enormously.